Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. 2 days before Christmas, in the quiet community of Ellington, Connecticut, an alarm panel activated before a single human voice broke the silence. Somewhere in the house, a panic signal pulsed through to a monitoring center. Within minutes, a dispatcher's line lit up with a breathless report. 911. There's been an attack. Responding officers moved in quickly, their entry log down to the second. They found a woman on the lower level who could not be revived. On the main floor, a man, zip-tied at the wrists, showing only minor injuries, repeated a story about a masked intruder. The first responders worked methodically. The residence was sealed off, and nothing inside would be touched without documentation. The chain of custody began from the moment they crossed the threshold. Every doorframe, stairwell, and item of furniture was recorded by camera. The location of the victim, the positioning of the restraints, the physical state of the caller, all marked and entered into the initial scene report. This first phase is where a case either holds together or starts to break apart. A genuine home invasion leaves certain types of disruption: trace evidence from an unknown party, paths of forced entry, clear departure routes. In contrast, a stage scene often reveals patterns that don't fit the story being told. Investigators in Ellington knew the difference, and they approached the house that morning with the same caution they'd use in any major felony scene. No assumptions were written into those early notes. The team recorded what was visible and what was measurable. In rooms where the suspect claimed an intruder had moved, technicians dusted for prints and photographed any displaced items. Areas that looked untouched were noted too. Sometimes what hasn't been disturbed says more than what has. In the lower level, the victim's position relative to the rest of the room was fixed in multiple shots from different angles. Upstairs, medics documented the caller's wrists, the zip ties, and the superficial abrasions. From a procedural standpoint, this was textbook: then contain, document, preserve. Only later would the analysis begin, the part where logs and data might confirm the caller's account or dismantle it. But even on that first day, there was one fact investigators couldn't ignore: the sequence of calls. The panic alarm had triggered a police dispatch before the man inside ever dialed 911. That timing would become a cornerstone in the weeks ahead. In towns like Ellington, crime doesn't just make headlines. It disrupts the ordinary rhythm of everyday life. Here, that disruption started with an alarm system doing exactly what it was designed to do. But when the house itself seems to be telling a story, the question becomes, whose version of events will hold under scrutiny? The residence in Ellington was treated as a primary crime scene the moment officers stepped in. Patrol held the threshold while detectives and evidence technicians took over. The objective was not to argue a theory, but to lock the environment exactly as it existed. A house in late December, one adult female unresponsive on the lower level, one adult male on the main floor with superficial injuries and plastic restraints. Everything else would be measured, photographed, and preserved before a single conclusion was placed on paper. A scene log was started at the front entry. Every person who crossed in or out signed time, role, and reason. Body-worn camera clocks were synced to the dispatch clock to keep a single timeline. A still photo sequence established a from big to small progression: front exterior, primary entry points, interior travel paths, and then close-ups of anything that might later be argued in court. Each frame was indexed to a photo log so prosecutors and defense could retrace the scene in the exact order it was captured. Technicians diagrammed the footprint of the house. They marked the stair run from the main floor down to the lower level, the position of furniture and fixtures, and the distances that mattered: door jamb to landing, landing to hallway, hallway to where the victim lay. Those measurements were entered into a scaled diagram, the kind that can be overlaid with later findings from the medical examiner or ballistics. No gore was recorded or described. The task here was geometry and orientation, not drama. On the main floor, medics documented the caller's wrists and minor abrasions before transport. The restraints, plastic zip ties, were photographed in place, then removed, bagged, and labeled with date, time, and initials. A swab for potential touch DNA on the binding surfaces was taken. The zip ties were then sealed in separate envelopes to maintain the chain of custody. This was a neutral act. Whether those items would later prove staging or struggle was not the question today. The job was to preserve their evidentiary value and avoid contamination. Evidence placards were set around items that could become points of contention: a displaced chair, a dropped object, a door that opened in a way that could matter to trajectory or sound transmission. Latent print processing targeted high-probability surfaces, door handles, banisters, light switches, while a second team surveyed flooring for any transferable footwear impressions. Where it made sense, an electrostatic lifter was used to capture dust impressions without altering the substrate. If nothing usable was recovered, that absence would be recorded with the same care as a positive hit. In casework like this, what is missing can be as probative as what is found, but the interpretation belongs to later chapters, not this one. At the exterior, a quick perimeter sweep identified possible access and exit points. Frames, screens, and locks were photographed in their found condition. The team documented them, then deferred judgment. To say forced entry or no forced entry at this stage would be premature. Tool mark comparisons and microscopic work need lab conditions. The note in the field file was simple: exam to follow. Inside the lower level, the victim's position was fixed with multiple angles. A placard marked the head-to-wall distance. Another recorded the nearest obstruction and the route by which responders had reached the body. A metal ruler appeared in close-ups to scale every photograph. The absence of visible disturbance in certain corners was captured too. When a scene is later reconstructed, jurors should see not just the focal area, but the undisturbed edges that frame it. Every piece of evidence was sealed with initials across the tape, then placed in a locked container for transport. The chain of custody sheet tracked each handoff. Even digital evidence started here. The alarm keypad, any visible home network hardware, and obvious consumer devices were photographed where they sat, with power states noted. Removal of electronics would wait for legal authority and a dedicated extraction team, but documenting their existence in situ kept the record intact. The preliminary interview of the caller occurred separately, away from the evidence technicians. The content of that interview, what he said happened, when and how, did not drive the photography or the measurements. It sat alongside what the cameras and rulers already captured. This separation matters. A clean investigation keeps the physical record independent from the narrative offered by anyone on scene. A senior detective walked the route a supposed intruder would have had to take, entry to contact to exit, without touching a surface. He looked for transfer points, places a hand would likely brace during a turn, a rail that should have a grab if a person ran, obstacles that almost force a person to shift weight in a predictable way. None of these observations were conclusions, they were simply prompts for later checks. The data aligned too cleanly, he said quietly to a colleague. Sometimes that's the problem. In towns like Ellington, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of a quiet community. Getting the record right protects more than a case. It protects trust. By midday, the interior had been mapped, the obvious items collected, and the remainder secured. Officers kept the house under guard while detectives drafted warrant language for a deeper digital sweep. What was clear at the end of this chapter was narrow but important. The physical scene now existed on paper and in images that a jury could walk back through, step by step, without a guide. The puzzle pieces were bagged, labeled, and logged. Interpretation would come next, and it would start with a timeline no one could outtalk. The devices and servers that record whether a story is even possible. As the team signed out for the day, the supervisor wrote a short note at the bottom of the scene log. No assumptions recorded, all findings provisional to lab and digital correlation. It was an ordinary sentence for a serious case, the kind that keeps an investigation disciplined when the pressure to solve it now gets loud. The house had been mapped, the photographs were logged. What came next was the clock. In any case, built on a sequence of events, investigators tightened the time axis first. That meant the alarm vendor's server logs, the dispatch center's CAD entries, and the public safety answering points recordings and metadata. Those records don't care who's talking. They care when something happened and in what order. Detectives drafted affidavit language and secured legal authority to obtain the alarm account history for the residents. The request was narrow and specific: the panic activation event, the channel that sent it, the device identifier associated with the account, and a zone history if any other sensors reported in the same window. The vendor returned a machine-readable log and a human-readable summary. The key element was an event tagged panic, recorded before any voice call originated from inside the home. No narrative was attached, only a timestamp and device origin tied to that property's account. To keep the record clean, the team verified the server clock source used by the alarm company. Most national vendors sync to a network time protocol. The report indicated regular synchronization, with drift measured in seconds, not minutes. That drift matters when a defense later argues that near simultaneous could mean out of order. Here, the vendor's certification showed a stable reference clock. Investigators noted the tolerance and bookmarked it for the prosecution's expert. At the County Communications Center, a supervisor pulled the CAD timeline covering the dispatch that morning. The CAD entry stamped the moment the alarm company pushed its signal through to the PS app and the moment the dispatcher created an incident card for responding units. Seconds later came unit assignments, route acknowledgments, and arrival times. Separately, analysts retrieved the audio and metadata from the 911 call placed by the man inside the house. That audio had its own timestamps, answer time, first utterance, and disconnect. The two tracks, machine alarm and human voice, were now laid onto the same axis. The order was not ambiguous. First the panic signal, then the personal call. Before they accepted that order as final, the team checked for any system offsets. Dispatch servers and body-worn cameras were compared against the same reference clock. Daylight savings adjustments were not in play that week. A short offset on one workstation was identified but didn't affect the order of events. It was documented anyway. When a case reaches court, defense counsel is entitled to every potential variance. This investigation made sure those variances were measured, not guessed. Alarm history isn't just on or off. It can include how an event is initiated. A panic activation can be triggered from a keypad or a key fob. The vendor's notation tied the event to a panic channel associated with the account, not with a door or a window. That distinction was marked in the report. It didn't prove anything by itself, but it framed what investigators should and shouldn't expect to see elsewhere. If the narrative was a sudden break-in, then window or door contacts sometimes leave a trail. If the narrative was an assault inside the home, a panic activation without companion door contacts might make sense. The proper conclusion would come later, when physical scene notes and lab work were overlaid. The 911 audio was reviewed in a dedicated room. What mattered most for this chapter was the tempo, not the tone. Time from call answer to incident description was measured in seconds. Location verification and officer safety questions were routine. The caller's report of a masked intruder was recorded, then set aside for this phase. The point here was sequencing. Did the house ask for help first, or did the person inside? The combined records showed the house did. A separate analyst compared the alarm vendor's time of event with the moment the first patrol acknowledged dispatch. This established the best case response interval. Those numbers often come up at trial when jurors want to know how long the scene sat uncontrolled. The answer, in relative terms, was the gap between machine request and patrol wheels rolling was short, and arrival followed within minutes. Nothing in the dispatch record suggested unusual delay. Investigators then looked for any anomalies during the alarm window that might explain a false trigger. Power loss? The vendor log showed normal line status. Communication failure? The log showed a successful transmission path, a test mode, none documented, a remote cancel, none documented. These notations are routine, but they matter. If a defense later says the system glitched, the field needs proof either way. Here, the vendor's server described a straightforward panic activation and a clean handoff to local dispatch. The caller's phone records were obtained through lawful process and cross-referenced against the PS app's metadata. Start time, end time, duration, nothing exotic, just service provider facts. That dataset answered a narrow question: exactly when the handset moved from idle to active during the incident. Again, the purpose was not to analyze words. That would come with interviews, and if the case went forward, with courtroom testimony. This stage fixed the start line on an axis that would soon carry many other data points. Investigators opened a fresh diagram and pinned these elements in clear order: panic signal, alarm company contact with dispatch, CAD incident creation, unit assignment, unit arrival, 911 call, start and end, officer report time, body-worn camera start markers. Each element was annotated with its source so that months later, a prosecutor could walk a jury through the morning without calling a single witness out of turn. The structure is boring by design. Boring holds up. This sequence ran alongside the physical record established in the last chapter. It did not reinterpret a single photograph or measurement. It simply told time. In towns like Ellington, the technical work can feel cold, but there's a human reason for it. Families deserve answers that rest on more than memory. The alarm timeline isn't a headline. It's a control variable. If it moves, the rest of the case can move. If it doesn't, the rest of the case has to live with what the clocks say. An experienced detective wrote one sentence on the whiteboard once the axis was set. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem. That wasn't a conclusion about guilt. It was a reminder to test for confirmation bias. The team scheduled a second review of the data set with a different analyst to reduce the risk of one interpretation hardening too early. 2 independent reads returned the same order of events. The file noted the peer check. The final task was memorialization. The alarm data were exported, hashed, and sealed. The CAD timeline printouts were initialed across their staples and scanned to the case drive. The 911 audio received a unique evidence number. Its playback copy was checked against the original recording for fidelity. Every seal and signature put a boundary around arguments that later had nothing to do with the facts. From a viewer's distance, this is the quiet part of a homicide investigation. There is no chase and no confrontation here, but the integrity of the case depends on exactly this kind of work. The alarm told a version of the morning. The man on the phone told another. Only one of them was a server. The next phase moves from the house's heartbeat to the victim's. A wearable device recorded motion and stillness. If the alarm timeline sets the clock, the Fitbit will set the steps. When clocks and steps disagree, investigators don't pick a side. They keep collecting until the record stops contradicting itself. If the alarm sets the clock, the victim's wearable sets the steps. That was the working rule as detectives moved from the measured house to the data that could not be remodeled with words. The goal here wasn't to guess intent. It was to determine whether the morning's timeline, already fixed by the alarm and dispatch records, was even compatible with the movements of the person who lost her life. Legal authority came first. Investigators drafted a narrowly tailored warrant for the victim's fitness tracker account and any paired devices. The scope covered account identifiers, device serial numbers, last sync times, step counts, movement windows, and the IP addresses involved in recent uploads. A companion order targeted the cell service and the home internet provider for subscriber records tied to that residence. The purpose wasn't to collect everything. It was to collect only what could answer a limited question. When did the victim's device last record motion, and from where did that data hit the cloud? The response returned 2 critical anchors. First, the device ID, unique to the tracker worn by Connie, paired to her known profile. Second, a sequence of sync events routed through an IP that resolved to the Dabate residence. The timestamps arrived in UTC, as most platforms do, and were converted to Eastern Time for local comparison. Time conversions were documented line by line to prevent later argument about time zones, explaining away conflicts. The sync window showed routine behavior, overnight quiet, then renewed activity in the morning hours, and a final movement window that persisted into mid-morning. In plain terms, the data said the wearer was still moving at a time that had to be reconciled with the claim that violence ended much earlier. Before drawing any inference, the team validated that the device actually belonged to the victim and not to a third party. Photographs from the scene and family-provided images confirmed the color and model. Purchase records corroborated ownership. The account email matched Connie's known address. Pairing logs showed the tracker had regularly synced with a specific smartphone prior to that week, the phone Connie used. The Bluetooth Association history listed the handset's identifier. That handset was already noted in the scene documentation and secured later under warrant for a forensically sound extraction. Wearable data can be noisy if you don't treat it like a lab instrument. Analysts checked for firmware updates or service outages that could spoof movement or delay uploads. None were present during the relevant window. They assessed whether step bursts could be caused by handling, transport, or an animal. The step pattern contained rise and fall variability, consistent with a person's short-range indoor movement rather than a single jostle or a device tossed into a bag. Analysts flagged spiky segments for later expert explanation, but found the overall arc consistent with ordinary morning activity. The home network records provided the next layer. The internet service provider returned subscriber information and logs showing recent successful connections from the residence's modem. Router settings and DHCP assignments, collected later under separate authority, helped map which devices were likely on the network that morning. The fitness tracker itself uses a phone as its conduit, so attention moved to the handset attributed to Connie. Even before the phone extraction, cloud logs showed morning syncs associated with that handset's app client. The source IP was the home's, not a workplace or a public network. Parallel to the wearable review, investigators obtained limited records from a social platform associated with Connie. The request targeted logins and short video postings from the morning in question. The platform returned timestamps and IPs, again in UTC. Once aligned to local time, those entries fell in an earlier morning window and tied to the same home IP. That pair, fit track movement extending into mid-morning and social activity earlier that morning from the house, didn't decide the case. It simply anchored the victim inside the residence and still moving later than the earliest narrative suggested. Because the defense in any modern homicide can raise fair challenges about digital reliability, the team built redundancies. Analysts confirmed that the last step was not merely a delayed upload of older motion. They examined raw event times versus server receipt times and compared those to the router's connection intervals. The pattern showed continuous or near-continuous availability, not a long offline period followed by a bulk dump. Where small gaps existed, normal in consumer devices, they were too short to explain away the core result. The victim's device was registering movement closer to mid-morning than to dawn. Every transformation of the dataset, download to forensic workstation, conversion from UTC to EST, export to charts, was hashed and recorded. An examiner created a read-only clone for the defense, anticipating discovery obligations. Nothing here was theatrical. It was administrative, the kind of administration that lets a jury see lines on a chart without doubting the hands that drew them. Detectives then placed these digital anchors against the already built alarm axis from the prior chapter. They did not restate exact times in narrative. The exhibit would carry those. They asked a binary question. Can both stories be true? Could there have been a lethal assault ending early in the morning, while the victim's device still registered movement into mid-morning and her account showed social activity from the house earlier that same morning? The answer demanded more testing, not a conclusion. But the friction between clocks and claims was now visible. Downstream, the wearable record would be paired with door-by-door physical measurements and later with the medical examiner's interval estimates because movement data and physiological data tell different parts of the same morning. For now, the team stuck to scope. They documented the procedure for acquiring the records, the authentication of the device and account, the alignment of time zones, and the error margins the vendor certified. And they wrote down the plain language takeaway. A digital witness places Connie alive and moving later than an early fatality narrative permits. There was one more check before the chapter closed: independent review. A second analyst, not involved in the initial request, reran the conversions and spot-checked the logs for misread entries. The cross-check reproduced the same windows. That note entered the file as insurance against a future claim that the conclusions hinged on a single person's spreadsheet. None of this erased the human cost. It is a hard truth in real-world crime that the data which secures accountability is the same data that confirms finality. Quietly, a senior detective acknowledged that fact as he printed the charts and slid them into the evidence binder. The work is cold because it needs to be. The purpose isn't. Families deserve timelines that rest on more than memory. With the wearable and home IP activity established, the investigation was ready to test the rest of the house's digital environment. Routine browser sessions, email pings, and phone metadata can look ordinary until they are placed on the same axis as an alarm and a fitness tracker. When routine holds, alibis sometimes hold with it. When routine breaks, patterns do too. That is the next step. By the start of 2016, investigators had in their possession a complete set of electronic data drawn from the Dabate residence and the couple's personal devices. The objective was clear: establish an accurate sequence of events for the morning of December 23, 2015, and determine whether Richard Dabate's account could be supported by hard evidence. The alarm system logs showed that the front door was opened at 9:01 a.m., followed by motion detections in the kitchen and living room. Richard told detectives that an armed intruder entered, forced him upstairs, tied him, and then shot Connie before fleeing. However, Connie's Fitbit registered movement inside the home until 10:05 a.m., more than an hour after the supposed departure of the intruder. Cell phone records added another layer. Connie exchanged text messages with a friend at 9:46 a.m., the content casual and without any indication she was in danger. At that same time, Richard's phone connected to the cell tower nearest their home, contradicting his statement that he had been outside chasing the suspect. The pattern was consistent. Both were inside the house during the period when Richard claimed the crime was already over. The alarm log revealed one more critical entry. The system was manually disarmed at 9:11 a.m. In a legitimate home invasion, this action would have been illogical. It did, however, align closely with the point when Connie's Fitbit recorded its final significant movement. When confronted, Richard suggested the Fitbit might have been malfunctioning or out of sync. A forensic examination of the device proved otherwise. The timestamps matched the server data and were consistent with the times recorded by the home's connected systems. Taken together, the Fitbit records, alarm system logs, and cellular data formed a synchronized timeline. It demonstrated that Connie was alive well after Richard claimed she had been killed, and that he was present inside the home during the critical minutes leading up to her death. The scenario of a masked intruder was losing any remaining credibility. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the prosecution's core strategy was clear. Strip away every layer of Richard Dabate's story until only verifiable data remained. The defense, equally determined, sought to undermine the reliability of that data. Especially the digital records the state claimed disproved his alibi. In testimony, forensic analysts described the methodical extraction of information from Connie Dabate's Fitbit. The device had logged steps taken inside the house at times when, according to Richard's statement, she should have already been incapacitated. Analysts explained how Fitbit's onboard accelerometers detect movement and how that data is timestamped before syncing with an online account. Those readings placed Connie alive and moving well after Richard claimed an intruder had shot her. Prosecutors then moved to the home's alarm system. Records from the security company detailed arming and disarming events, door sensor activations, and the absence of any forced entry alerts on the morning of December 23. This absence undercut Richard's assertion of a break-in. Cell tower logs added another layer. Call detail records and tower pings placed Richard's phone in locations inconsistent with his narrative, including evidence that he had been texting his extramarital partner during key moments of the alleged crime window. Jurors heard excerpts from those messages, not for their emotional content, but to establish time, location, and intent. The defense challenged the precision of each digital source. Fitbit data, they argued, could be skewed by device errors or unintentional movements. Alarm system logs might not reflect a sophisticated intruder's tampering. Cell tower triangulation, while powerful, was not GPS-level exact. But the prosecution countered that the convergence of three independent digital streams left little room for coincidence. In cross-examination, state witnesses were careful to connect each piece of data to a documented chain of custody. The forensic examiner who pulled the Fitbit data could account for every moment from seizure to analysis. The telecom representative explained how call records are generated and stored. The alarm company's technician described the integrity safeguards built into the logging process. By the end of the week, the jury had been exposed to a prosecution case that was less about emotion and more about mechanical consistency. Digital timestamps, when combined with the absence of supporting physical evidence for Richard's claims, formed a framework that the state argued could not be explained away. By the time investigators reached the advanced digital forensics stage, the broad outlines of the crime were established, but proving intent and dismantling Richard Dabate's account required precision. The physical crime scene in Ellington, Connecticut had already yielded limited direct evidence, no forced entry, no stolen items. What remained was a set of interconnected digital records that could establish a definitive sequence of events on December 23, 2015. The State Crime Lab processed Connie Dabate's Fitbit activity logs in conjunction with her phone usage. Data showed she was moving and interacting with her device well after the time Richard claimed she had been attacked. This conflicted directly with his sworn statements to responding officers. Parallel analysis of the home's security system confirmed door and motion sensor activations inconsistent with his version of a masked intruder entering and leaving. The investigative team reconstructed a minute-by-minute digital map, the Fitbit's step count ending abruptly, phone signals ceasing within the same narrow time frame, and security logs showing no exit matching an unknown assailant. This was supported by cell tower records placing Richard's phone movements in precise patterns inside and near the property, not in pursuit of help as he had alleged. Investigators also obtained text message and email records revealing that Richard had maintained regular communication with a woman he was having an affair with. These communications, recovered in full through a lawful search warrant, demonstrated an established plan for a future together, including discussions about ending his marriage. The context of these messages undermined any claim that the shooting had been a random or defensive act. A pivotal discovery came from a timeline overlay. At the exact moment Connie's Fitbit registered movement, Richard's work email account showed an active login from the home's IP address. Forensic analysts interpreted this as further evidence that he was staging activities during the period he alleged the intruder was present. By isolating these technical records and presenting them in a unified sequence, investigators effectively collapsed his alibi. There was no longer a viable window for an unknown offender to have entered, committed the crime, and escaped without detection. The digital ecosystem around the Dabate household had recorded too much. The prosecution's digital evidence narrative would later become one of the most compelling elements of the case in court. It transformed the abstract timeline into a clear, unbroken sequence of deliberate actions, eroding any possibility of a mistaken account or split-second accident. By the time the case reached trial in 2022, the facts had been carefully layered by years of forensic and procedural work. Jurors heard how Connie Dabate's final morning unfolded, reconstructed not from speculation, but from the digital traces she left behind. Her Fitbit steps, phone activity, and the silent logs of the home's alarm system. Each source aligned, exposing a timeline that contradicted Richard Dabate's account of a masked intruder. The prosecution emphasized motive: Richard's extramarital affair, his girlfriend's pregnancy, and his reluctance to face a divorce. They presented the crime not as a sudden outburst, but as a calculated act designed to reshape his life without the cost of separation. Digital forensics became the backbone of the case, showing that while Richard claimed Connie was attacked earlier, her Fitbit recorded movement well after the alleged time of death. The defense sought to sow doubt, suggesting alternative scenarios and questioning the reliability of digital devices. But the combination of timestamp data, inconsistent statements, and Richard's financial and personal entanglements formed a cohesive narrative. After deliberation, the jury found him guilty of murder, tampering with evidence, and providing false statements. In 2022, the court sentenced Richard to 65 years in prison. The verdict reflected not only the strength of the evidence but also the growing role of technology in modern investigations. It was a reminder that in the pursuit of truth, silence can still speak, and data rarely lies. This crime left behind more than a conviction. It left a cautionary trace in the public record. Lies may fracture a moment, but facts, preserved in devices and systems, can bridge the gap between justice delayed and justice served. For Connie's family, the outcome did not erase the loss, but it affirmed that the truth, no matter how meticulously concealed, remains within reach. Looking back, this case is a stark reminder that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply someone tries to bury it. Integrity, trust, and respect are not just values. They are the foundation of every relationship, and once broken, the damage can be irreversible. I share this not to dwell on tragedy, but to encourage all of us to value honesty before it's too late. What are your thoughts on how technology helped uncover the truth here? Do you believe digital evidence will change the way justice works in the future? If this story touched you or made you think, leave a comment with your perspective, or even let me know where you're watching from. And if you'd like to hear more real-life crime stories that matter, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss what's next.